Now this was a long module, and this course project is pretty much done. But there's one final tweak I want to do or implement. At the moment in this app, we don't really need Vuex. Whenever we visit a page, we load all the data we need anyways. And especially here on the coaches page, I'm not sure about that. It's not likely that new coaches will be signing up all the time, and we therefore always need to load the latest data whenever we go back to this page. We could instead cache data locally and only refetch it after, let's say, a minute or so, or once we manually clicked the refresh button. And that's something we can easily implement with Vuex, and it then again also shows us why we might need locally managed state, which we do with Vuex, side by side with server-side managed data. Because currently we almost replace Vuex with Firebase, and that's not the idea. So what could we do here to not fetch new coach data all the time and instead reuse the existing data? In our coaches module, in the state, besides managing the coaches, we could add a last fetch key, which initially is null. Now last fetch should hold a timestamp. It should save a timestamp whenever we fetched new data. For that, we can add a new mutation, which we name set fetch timestamp, for example, where I get access to my state, and where I then set state last fetch, which is this new data property we just added, equal to new date dot get time. And this gives us the current time and date as a timestamp, as a big number. Basically, the time in milliseconds since the beginning of time, which in JavaScript is at the beginning of 1970. So now we store this time snapshot, this timestamp, in last fetch. Now we can commit this action whenever we fetched data. So in our actions, here in load coaches, that's where we fetched data. There, at the end, we can commit more than one mutation, and we can also commit our new mutation set fetch timestamp, which we just added. And we don't need to provide any payload here because set fetch timestamp doesn't need any. So now we store that timestamp when we last fetched data. Why am I doing that? Because now we can add a getter to this coaches module, which we maybe name should update. And here I in the end want to get my last fetch timestamp and find out if it is, let's say, less than a minute ago. So here we get our state, and then we get last fetch by accessing state.lastFetch. And we first of all check if last fetch is falsy. For example, at the beginning, it's null. If that's the case, I return true because then we should update. If we have no timestamp yet, we should update. Else, if we do have a timestamp, I need to find out if it's more than a minute ago. So we can get a current timestamp now by getting new date, get time. So that's then the timestamp when we use the getter. And now we can return the result of comparing the current timestamp with the stored timestamp. We simply deduct last fetch from the current timestamp, divide that by 1000, and check if that's greater than 60. That means that it's more than a minute ago. This will return true if it's more than a minute ago, so we then should update again. It returns false, so we shouldn't update again, if it's less than a minute ago. Divided by 1000 because both these numbers are in milliseconds. So now should update yields true if we should fetch again and false otherwise. And where exactly do we use should update now? Well, in the actions of the coaches module, here in load coaches. Before we send a request, I want to check if we actually should fetch coaches. So we can check if context getters should update is true, or to be precise, if it's not true. If it's not true, I will just return here I will not continue with the rest of the code, and therefore we will not send a request. Instead, we'll stick to the data which we currently have in our store. So we'll not fetch again then. If should update is true, this if statement will be skipped and we will fetch data again. By doing that, if I save that, if I reload, we fetch data, but if I then go to requests and come back, you see no loading spinner, because now we don't load again. And after a minute, you would see it again. Then it would fetch it again and store it for another minute. But refreshing with the refresh button should work. We should always be able to do that. So in order to implement that, I will actually change this action a little bit and expect a payload, which holds a property that tells me that I absolutely do have to fetch again. So which overrides this getter basically. Here we can simply add an additional check in this if condition here and check if payload, let's say, has a force refresh property. And if it doesn't have that, if that's false, and we should not update, then we skip this. Otherwise, if either this is true or this is true, this if check will be skipped and we will fetch again. So now we will be able to set a force refresh payload to this action, and if it's true, we will fetch again, no matter if it's more or less than a minute ago since we last did it. Now we just need to make sure this payload is passed into this action, and for that we can go to coaches list, which is where this action is dispatched, and here in load coaches we now want to pass this payload, the force refresh key. And this should be false if load catches is called from inside the created lifecycle hook, because there I want to use the caching. But force refresh should be true if this is called through the button, through this refresh button in the template. So therefore, we simply need to make this load coaches method a bit more flexible. We can add a refresh parameter and set this to false as a default value. This is supported modern JavaScript syntax, and provide refresh, this parameter, as a value to force refresh in our payload. And that way, if we call load coaches without an argument, the default value of false will be used. But we can now also call load coaches, when we click the button, manually and pass in true, which forces a refresh. So if we do that and save that and reload, it fetches this initially because the time has passed, but not thereafter. But if I click refresh, we force that and we do refresh everything and load our data again. And that's just a tiny tweak, an optional addition, but I think it makes sense here, and it hopefully shows you what you can do with Vue, a backend, and Vuex. And of course, that's just the tip of the iceberg. You can do much more than that.